Hi, folks, and thanks for joining us here at Some Future for episode 24 of our podcast. We are your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hello.
What's up, man?
Hey.
As always, today we've got some pretty interesting topics. On Present Futures, we will be discussing the future of animal preservation and facial recognition technology and privacy. On Paleo Futures, we will be discussing the life and work of Ada Lovelace. And on FizBiz, we will be discussing the future of drug enforcement. As always, we hope that you enjoy your show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle @SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page, or simply connect with us on LinkedIn or Facebook. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us on social media. Now let's see what the future has in store for us in Some Future.
That's Some Future.
Okay, Chris. So we've talked about de-extinction on this podcast before. It's something that something that I'm actually pretty excited about. I mean, we've talked about it a lot. As a humanist, I really like the idea of doing something to reverse the harmful effects humanity has had on the world. The idea of bringing back species that were specifically made extinct directly or indirectly through human actions is a cause I think we should all be getting behind. Therefore, for my present futures today, I wanted to talk about something that is not so far in the future, but which scientists can work on today and what we can achieve. That's using technology to protect the world's fragile ecosystems and not only help preserve endangered species, but also to help them grow to sustainable numbers. So it's not a shock to most of our listeners that the world's human population continues to increase while the world's plant and animal populations continue to decrease. All told, scientists have described almost 2 million plant and animal species, and the current rate is that they are finding 18,000 new species each year. While this may seem incredibly prolific, a study in the journal PLS Biology conservatively estimated that there are 8.75 million species on Earth, the vast majority of which are unknown to science. So at the current rate of species discovery, the authors calculated it could take hundreds of years to describe them all. Long before then, within a century, 75% of those will be extinct, and between 30 to 50% of them could face extinction this century alone. So according to the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, not the Wrestling Federation, the planet has already lost half of its wildlife over the past 40 years, and between 200 and 2,000 extinctions occur every year. So the simple fact is, we aren't doing enough to save these species. As you know, there's a race to catalog and find all of these plant and animal species. One of these projects is called the Earth Biogenome Project, which exists to take samples of and catalog these species' DNA before they go extinct. Still, projects like these are called moonshot projects because we're in the midst of what scientists are calling the sixth mass extinction event, or what they're calling the Holocene extinction, with the last one having occurred 66 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. Scientists now estimate that at that time, scientists estimated that 76% of all species were wiped out, including the remaining large species dinosaurs that we were familiar with, the large species dinosaurs. So the Holocene extinction, which started around 10,000 years ago, began with large species who couldn't handle the warming climate fast enough, but who also couldn't handle the increase of human hunting and other practices. So I'm talking about mammoths, I'm talking about saber-toothed tigers, things like that it was a combination. But now it seems to be clearly and solely responsible based on human behavior. So it makes sense, Chris, that we should be working on solutions to not only just catalog these species with the hope that we can bring them back, but also to help preserve the species that already exist and hopefully give scientists enough time to catalog and hopefully save these wild populations. I just wanted to bring up a few cool projects that are being done right now to save animal species. I wanted to bring these up because I keep hearing how these conservation efforts are being put to the test due to increased friction with local populations. So obviously you've heard, it's been in the news actually a lot recently. So there's actually, if you saw in the news recently, there was an orca whale who had carried her calf for about 5 days. Her calf was born malnourished, and it died within 24 hours of her giving birth. And it takes about 16 to 18 months for an orca to that's their gestation period. So they said, and the title of the article said, mourning and love aren't just human characteristics, because she was the calf she obviously knew was dead and just was in mourning and carrying it around. So what's really sad about that too is that there's only about 75 orcas left in the Pacific Northwest, and they are all severely malnourished, and they're facing the realistic expectation that they will become extinct if something isn't drastically done to save their population. A lot of the reason they're malnourished is because their main food source is salmon. And human beings are overfishing the salmon populations, and salmon populations are going extinct, which is also causing this negative effect in the orca population. So that's just one example that I wanted to bring up that made me think about doing this for our podcast. I want to talk about some of the tech that's actually helping to save these people, or these animals and plants first, and then we can go into some more stories. And I mean, you can tell me what you've heard of or seen, but I think one thing that's doing really well is IoT. So, IoT is everywhere, IoT everywhere, that type of thing. So people don't realize that smart devices don't just exist in cities and cars, but you can have so many different types of smart devices that can aid in conservation efforts, for example. Cisco has set up a system in the national parks in South Africa, which is home to around 80% of the remaining black rhino population, which is around 4,000, hovering around 4,000 animals. And it's called they've dubbed this system Connected Conversation. Basically, it's a network of IoT devices that monitor the park and are controlled at a center hub, so park rangers are immediately notified when someone enters the park. Their whole idea is to stop these issues before they can before the animals can be harmed. They're basically putting a digital fence around the park to catch people, helicopters, things like that, to stop them from taking the rhino horns. IoT beehives. So there's beehives. Obviously, you know that 90% of the honeybee population in the United States is extinct or is dying off. It's a huge issue. And they finally, a couple of years ago, realized what it was. And they figured it was a combination of issues, but mainly it was due to these mites that would come in, lay eggs on the bees, and then they would kill off the bee populations because they would grow in the hive and kill the entire hive. What the IoT is doing is that they're actually they've created a detection system so that as soon as these mites enter the hive, they can eliminate them and eliminate the eggs before they take over the entire hive. So that's a huge thing. IBM, a company that you and I are both very familiar with, has created a new predictive analytics software that can be used to collect huge amounts of complex information about wildlife, such as what people think about them, where the animals are located, why they are hunted, how everything from educational level to access to medications impact their decisions. And then they can use that data to figure out the best areas to focus conservation efforts on. So this actually high-tech software might be a big key to saving some species that are currently critically endangered. Gene sequencing, you and I talked about this in our last episode, using gene drives to alter the genes of animals. So the Tasmanian devil is faced with an invasive disease that is killing off the population, where they're trying to basically change the genes of these Tasmanian devils to be able to better fight these infections and basically result in the survival of the species. Smart collars, they've been around for years, basically stating where an animal is. But they've actually evolved over time so that they can now tell, like a farmer, something like, if the wolf is near their population, so they can move their cattle instead of having to shoot the wolf, or the bear, or if an elephant is near, what to do, things like that. And they've actually created fences, IoT fences, to keep elephants out of from taking people's food in India and things like that, because I guess that's a big problem there. And then there's like Google Maps and other satellite programs that help stop illegal deforestation in remote areas. So these are all technologies that are being implemented. Chris, I mean, do you know of any other technologies that you've heard of?
Well, I mean, I want to stop there because I'll come back to the technologies in a second. The technology part of the conversation. The one thing I wanted to bring up too is just the fact of conservation. I think conservation itself, kind of the taking care of the earth and everything in it, has really been a touchstone for Futurist in the past. We know we were speaking of Daniela Meadows and how vital she was to the limits to growth, and the population bomb was a part of it, and I think just the idea of taking care of the planet is extremely important to the Futurist movement. It's one, the environment is one of the steep foundational techniques that we use when we think about, how something's going to affect a particular futuristic topic. So, this one is really fantastic. I do like the kind of dual stuff that we're talking about here. So not only can we do our scientific endeavors to achieve and find more species, but I'm also interested in the ways to keep the species alive and sort of how we deal with ecosystems. I think also too, one thing that Futurist and we delved on this on our fourth episode, right? The future of food, how we use food properly, whether it's through factory farming techniques, tighter local communities when it comes to farming and food, really just interacting with our animal brothers and sisters on this planet. I think just the fact that there are folks, scientists, futurists, NGO leaders thinking about how to not only find as many species that are on the planet, but ensure that we have a rich ecology of them is fantastic. One thing I wanted to note, especially on that, right, when we were talking about the sixth, extinction, as well as the latest one, the Holocene extinction that happened at the end of the Ice Age. There's been a lot of recent research on those extinctions. I'm fascinated with old civilizations. That not only am I futurist, but I'm also fascinated with like old school civilizations like the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians and all that stuff. And there's been a lot of work around what happened and what really happened beyond just the fact that some humans in some certain areas probably did end up killing a lot of these mammoths and would-be megafauna. But at that time, there was most probably an epic electrical storm, that probably had to do with solar storms, which created lightning and fires worldwide, and changed really the atmosphere of the world, causing gigantic floods. We were in an ice age, and then there was some turbulence for like many years after that too. So the animal population had turbulence, and I think it's something like 80 to 90% of the megafauna around the world died, or at least in North America. There was a lot of megafauna. There was like 3 different elephants, rhinos, huge animals in North America, and they all died out. So whatever we have left, is what was left over, and those were the smaller ones. So it's interesting, of course, to always think about how we can keep the past by looking at the future. We look at the past to do it as best as we can, and so as a good futurist, you're always gonna keep your eye open. And I'm glad I'm able to understand a little bit about that Holocene research. In terms of the technology, I think it's something that we say all the time, right? Technology could possibly save us, whether it's visual recognition AI that some technology firm can deliver to ensure that we can track these animals. I think the computation of understanding what their ecosystems are like, and maybe even systems dynamics, right? A futuristic technique that's used to deal with population problems. And then one thing you brought up that we kind of sort of skimmed over, but it's the age-old tragedy of the commons problem, right? We're fishing too much. We're cutting down rainforest. We're eliminating species. I think we were just talking about, or I just read how Trump's wall was just written up by 1,000 scientists around the world, saying if they're going to build that wall, they're going to kill the ecology of hundreds of thousands of different plants and birds and deer and everything that goes through that. And that is something that human beings should not try to do, right? Is affect their local environments nefariously. So, I think there's a lot to talk about when it comes to animal conservation for sure. I'm glad technology is a part of it. I'm glad, just good old scientific exploring is a part of it. But I think we need both so we can have a vital, collection of flora and fauna around the world.
Well, I think you brought up an interesting topic, and this is something I was actually going to talk about, is that human population. So human population growth is something that, has been decried for years. The fact that we're continuing to grow, but it actually turns out a new study came out that said that we might be reaching a peak period of human growth. And that, what we'll reach is instead of the 10 billion, $9 billion or 9 billion people figure that a lot of people were throwing out, we might just get up to 8.5 billion. Now, 8.5 billion is still a lot because we're only hovering around 6 billion something right now. So that's still another 2 billion people in the world, and that's a lot of people. But they're saying that what will happen is what's happening with a lot of first world nations is that as countries become more they get involved into the first world and they get brought into the first world, that they will continue to have less and less people. Now, they also said, immigration is going to continue to be a huge issue because you have countries like in Europe that want 0% immigration, where that's a huge issue in the fact that these countries are producing a lot more people than a first world nation like Japan, which has a negative growth. The United States actually has a steady growth, and what they think is because of the large portion of immigration that we have in the United States, that it's leading to that steady, that stagnation. That we're not losing or growing our population, which is what I guess most countries want to achieve. And so that's an interesting aspect. I do agree that the technology can only take us so far. We actually have to do something as far as a world. We have to do something where we can come together and say, hey, we need to put a check on ourselves when it comes to population. Having 2 children tops for every family, that should be something that everyone should do, probably in some sort of tiered fashion. I don't know. It's really hard to even ideate on how that would be implemented, because you see what happens with China. As China did the one-child policy, and then now they have a really rapidly aging population that they're going to be facing in the next couple of decades with significant workforce shortages and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that is something that needs to be done, though, because we need to protect the life that we have, because it's not only because, I want to be touchy, feely, all that stuff, is that these animals actually can help us come up with cures for diseases. And these plants and animals can do that. They can show us different aspects of human biology that we might be able to incorporate, when you come to gene editing, things like that. Those are important aspects to have. And it's not like these animals were created yesterday. These are from millions of years of evolution that these animals were created. And it's something that if we lose them, it could be potentially forever. And that's why the scientists are so quickly trying to catalog all of these animals before we lose them. And, I'm hoping that we can do that. And maybe with a combination of that with human laws, we can prolong the life of these species long enough to, catalog them enough to when human populations start to go down again, we can reintroduce the species and have a healthier world because of it.
Okay, so on my present futures, I'm going to talk about facial recognition technology. I think we've been talking about this. It's been in the news, but I just happened to come across this CBC, this Canadian website, and it was talking about how these 2 Calgary malls were using facial recognition technology to track the shoppers' ages and genders without notifying them. So a visitor at the Chinook Central Mall in South Calgary spotted a browser window that seemingly was left open on the mall's directory and exposed the facial recognition software that was working in the background. And they took a photo, they posted it to Reddit, so it was just sort of kerfuffle. And the mall's parent company, Cadillac Fairview, said the software, which they began using in June, counts people in the directory and predicts, upon their age or gender, but it doesn't record any of their photos or videos or anything like that. But they did say, and I found this is very strange, it said, we don't require consent, but we're not capturing or retaining images as well, said the Cadillac Fairview spokesperson. So I thought I thought that was very strange, sort of how they worded that. What could have been a poor privacy story when it came to people coming in the mall. So, this story made me think, there's a lot of this stuff sort of happening in the news. Amazon, they have this new facial recognition technology that they're going to start deploying to government and law enforcement agencies. It's called branded recognition with a K, because they're tech companies. They're got to be cool and different. So I got to put
cool
K
name
in there. Yeah, branded recognition. So it's built on their cloud platform, essentially. And, it's gotten some flack in the news. The ACLU did kind of a test run to see like how it would work, and it ended up where the recognition, the system, it wrongly identified 28 members of Congress as arrestees. And by the way, I mean, who knows? Maybe those politicians really are crooks anyway, right? But but this just goes to show you, what the power is behind this sort of facial recognition stuff. The city of Orlando dropped a pilot program because there was sort of some flack for these sorts of things. And despite this, so Amazon is definitely pushing this forward. They in their website, it says Amazon's branded recognition program makes it easy to add image and video analysis to all your applications. You just provide an image or a video to the recognition API, and the service can identify objects, people, text, scenes, and activities, and as well as detect any inappropriate content. So we're talking just, a true eyes in the sky tracking everything and anything that's there. And because it's on Amazon's cloud, that means it could be deployed in a numerous amount of applications, to include on cell phones, or even inside, that map inside that Calgary mall. So just thinking on all of this, this brings me back to one thing that we've been talking about recently, and this has been China, right? So, when we think about facial recognition software and tracking and all this sort of stuff, I think we think of Chinese social credit system, right? It's the national reputation system that's developed by the Chinese government. By 2020, they want to standardize the assessment of citizens and business, economic, and social reputation and or credit. So it's unclear, what's going on with this particular system completely. But it's in work right now. So, what's interesting, it's being used to purify society. There was this CBS News correspondent named Ben Tracy, and, he, has been tracking this stuff, and he sees that it's currently happening. Chinese citizens are currently getting social credit scores, whether they pay their taxes on time, or whether they even cross the street, or even if they post online. So it says in the article, when Lu Hui recently tried to book a flight, he was told he was banned from flying because he was on a list of untrustworthy people. And it turns out Lu's a journalist who was ordered to apologize because he wrote a series of tweets, and only then would be he allowed to board airplanes. So this is and so this social credit system, right, could be linked to this facial recognition, and then you have this firm like this Chinese firm called Sesame Credit, which assigns citizens a fluctuating score between 350 and 950 based on what they buy, what they associate with, and what they post. And the Chinese government, tells them whether they have a positive energy or a lower energy, and the low results and result in punishment. And the quote from the government is, if trust is broken in one place, restrictions are imposed everywhere. Safeguard judicial authority, raise judicial credibility, and create an upward, charitable, sincere, and mutually helpful social atmosphere. Written from the people who are creating that social atmosphere. So, I mean, this is a lot of Orwellian stuff. I know we've talked about, 1984 in the past, but, I think I've been reading bits and pieces of this, but now that it's coming together,
scary stuff.
Exactly. I mean, it's super frightening. They're stopping people from boarding planes. I mean, what do you think about all this?
Man, I'll tell you. I mean, so we've talked about this, and I know it seemed to be somebody who's like a huge decrier of China. And I actually connected with somebody on LinkedIn recently, and he's a Chinese politician. He writes about how they should take over Taiwan militarily, and then like in the next year, otherwise they'll have a hard time taking it over. And dude, China is not messing around, and I feel like part of it's our fault because we're the ones who introduced capitalism into their society, and they just kind of took it and run with it. But it's still a very much a police state, and it's getting worse. I mean, there are things I heard. There was like a 10,000 people. There's like 10,000 protests a year in China, and these are things we never hear about because the government quickly squashes them. It's this technology, and that's one thing is technology. There's the people who are on one side say the technology is good for all humanity, and the other side they're like, oh, technology can be really dangerous if it's in the wrong hands. And I fear like that's what's going to happen in China, and I do fear that it could happen in the Western world too, and in the sense of give me liberty or give me death. The idea of what do you want, security or freedom? Why it has to be one or the other for a lot of people. It can't be a good mixture. And if you want to be protected from terrorism, and we can stop all these terrorists from entering the United States or these criminals from doing these actions, well, that also means that you could be profiled, and a file could be kept on you, because that's what China's doing. They're keeping a file on all of their citizens to say, oh, you cannot do this or can do this. And I mean, it happened recently. There was a guy whose daughter threw ink on like an image of the Chinese president. And it was like, and they recorded it, put it on YouTube or something like that, and she disappeared. And then she like wound up in a psychiatric institution, quote unquote, because of she needed help or something. And then when the father who hadn't seen her in like a year, like took to YouTube and was doing like a live broadcast. I don't know if it was on YouTube, but like it was like on some live broadcasting website. The police stopped him in mid broadcast, and then they arrested him. And you hear him getting arrested and saying, "What did I do? What did I do?" Like that is the future of China, and I'm worried that's the future of our world with these types of technologies.
I mean, that's completely wild, right? That it would be that quick. But that's the speed and the power of technology. And I think you're right to bring up that fact, right? We were just talking on a present future about how we can use technology to fix the animal population problems that we have. Hey, there are issues, right, when you implement technology into places, and here is exact one. Right, there's 176 million surveillance cameras in operation in China right now, with a plan to double that, which means they're videotaping everything is data, and this has a big impact on what you could be. This is exactly what was seen in the Nosedive episode of Black Mirror. The one in where everyone in a future society has a social credit score and can be nudged up and down based on interactions. This is something that we talked about on a Paleo Futures as well. I mean, just the fact that you're creating a social credit scores and status symbols between members of society. In essence, you're sort of recreating a caste system for the future people of the world or future people of a country. This does a lot of stuff. The inability to interact with people. Maybe there's people deemed lower than you because they have lower, what do you call it? Credit score, and in turn, you don't want to hang out with them because they're going to bring you down. But meanwhile, they may have this really interesting, part of them that's super insightful, that's going to help you come up with bigger and better ideas, or maybe they're great at doing this one thing. I mean, in essence, it's kind of doing the exact opposite of what America did, which is, hey, there are no rules. We're going to let you do whatever you want. You can interact with anybody you want. You can learn whatever you want, and in turn, you can actually maybe take a little bit of pieces of this person, a little bit of piece of that person, come together with great ideas and create great entrepreneurship, outstanding innovation, and a way to really interoperate with information. I find this whole social capital, facial recognition, privacy of degrading society to be possibly threatening, not only threatening, but also maybe suffocating to what innovation could be and what people could be. I don't want to see that happen. I don't want to see us lose our ability to communicate and interoperate with the people because we're fearful of what our score will be, you know?
Well, and Chris, look at this, man. You were previously in the military. Can you imagine? I think that's the next, world war in our opinion. Maybe it's not based off of countries trying to attack each other and things like that. It's based off of freedom. The idea of being able to be a free person and not have to have a social credit score and be able to. I mean, some of our entrepreneurs in this country were broken in debt and were able to contribute so much to society by figuring out a solution to a problem, doing something like that. But if they had a negative social score and they wouldn't have been able to travel to that business meeting or something like that, can you imagine what would have happened? I fear that that's the next war is going to be against these dictatorships, and they are dictatorships, and even worse than dictatorships. I mean, this is worse than 1984 because 1984 didn't imagine artificial intelligence helping with this 24-hour surveillance that doesn't sleep, that that can if you're walking down the street at 3 a.m. it sees you. If you're podcasting at 4 a.m. in the morning, it knows that you're doing that. Like, that is a very scary future, and one that I know most Americans don't want. And I imagine that there's going to be a mass exodus in China very soon with things like this of anybody with means who can get out will.
Yeah, and I think one last point is one ethical question that people will be asking, and we've spoken on this, is right. What is the future of privacy? We don't talk about philosophy all the time in futures, but it's actually an extremely important part of futures, right? Not only when it comes to Westworldian robotics and how would you harm a robot, right? That's sort of a futuristic type question. Another thing is, if you're willing to open up yourself to data, how much data are you willing to give away? And I think, hopefully there are some PhD students right now wrestling with that very question of how do you have a society that is interconnected, that has these mechanisms that allow us to understand how to better the economy. In some ways, maybe some of this social credit stuff might be helpful to how the economy interoperates, and for you getting things like a mortgage or ensuring that you can go get enough money for your college education. Obviously, we don't want to slow down the machinations of economy. That's extremely important, as growth is extremely important to the economy. But what we can't lose in our quest for understanding the world is lose our humanity. Like you said, lose our freedom. We're on this earth to be able to freely communicate and express ourselves. And I think any sort of suffocation of that freedom via a gamification that really might not even be completely controlled by the people could have some devastating effects to society, and in turn, leave us with an indeterminate and possibly negative future. Okay, so for Paleo Futures today, the last Paleo Futures, I think we had Donella Meadows, which is great. We had a female futurist, and here, every now and again we don't pick a determined futurist, right? We just pick someone who is a sort of a forward thinker, and we have another woman, which I'm proud to have, and
go women.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's really good, man. We're all about them. And promoting, gender equality. That's what this podcast is about.
Sure.
So we're talking about Augusta Ada King Knoll, the Countess of Lovelace, otherwise known as Ada Lovelace. So, a little bit of background from her. She was born in 1815, died 1852. She was an English mathematician and a writer, chiefly known for her work on Charles Babbage's proposed mechanical gear or general purpose computer called the analytical engine. She was the first to recognize that the machine had applications beyond pure calculations, and published her first algorithm intended to be carried out by such a machine. And as a result, she's pretty much recognized as the first person, really the first coder, right? The first person who saw that a computer machine had the ability to do, sort of fantastic things. So sort of how this came about, right? She's got an interesting background, right? So she is the love child of Lord Byron, and and Lord Byron, sort of hung out
Famous
with
poet.
right, and so he hung out with really the Victorian cool posse, right? So like Charles Dickens and all these famous scientists and whatnot. And because he valued science, he wanted her to really pursue mathematics. So he just surrounded her with mathematics, and she just ate it up. And just so happened that one of her godfathers, essentially, or one of the people in her life, was Charles Babbage, who's known as being really the father of the computer. He invented the first mechanical computer called the differential computer, and then eventually his work led to him to another a mechanical computer called the analytical engine, and that is the one that Ada, because she knew him, they had this sort of frenetic back and forth letter writing campaign where she essentially figured out how to create code. Literally the first, coder for this, analytical engine, which is, pretty interesting. But, I think what's even more interesting, beyond her, this program, I think like the underlying thing is they're trying to calculate numbers. So they calculated the seventh Bernoulli number, but it was sort of beyond just her doing the code in order to do these calculations. I mean, essentially she was one of the first people to ideate on how you can turn something that's mathematical, turn something that is purely code, and you could manipulate it in just about anything you want to do. Walter Isaacson, in his book The Innovators, he says, this insight was powerful, right? It was the first concept of what the digital age is. He says, any piece of content, data, or information, whether it's music, text, pictures, numbers, symbols, doesn't matter, could be expressed in digital form. It could be manipulated by machines, and this is what Ada said in her notes. And she said that she imagined a future in which these computers could be more powerful, do further analysis. She said, a new and vast and powerful language is developed for the future of analysis, in which to wield its truths so that these may become more speedy and accurate practical applications for the purposes of mankind. So if anything, she was, a futurist in pure form, right? Because she had this just little piece of code, this little machine that, maybe only certain science nerds in Victorian high society knew about. And literally she's imagining what it could be beyond that. She also wrote that the analytical engine, they might act upon other things besides number, where objects were found whose mutual fundamental relations can be expressed by the abstract science of operations. For instance, the fundamental relations of pitch, sound, and science and harmony, and even musical composition was susceptible to expressions, adaptations, and so the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. So, we could say that she is also maybe one of the thought leaders behind the future of electronic music as well, or how composition can be changed. So these insights are particularly, interesting. And I think even a FizBiz sort of thing. So I was, there's a couple,
FizBiz.
Right. FizBiz, right. So in terms of the business aspect, right, so she has these conversations with this gentleman, Charles Babbage, right, the inventor of the mechanical computer, and they have this letter writing campaign. In the letter, they talk about her, having to debug code, which is super interesting. But another thing that I found really interesting is that, after she wrote this algorithm, she sent him this like 16-page long letter where she presupposes that if he goes to sell the machine, that she be the brains behind the operation and he be the technical person who builds the stuff. So in essence, she was also not only one of the first coders, but was also one of the first startup entrepreneurs because she essentially said, I'm going to be the CEO and the brains behind this, and you could be the technology officer. So, I got to say, as I went deeper into this story, the Ada Lovelace story, I just read it in Walter Isaacson's The Innovators. So I just kind of got barely a glimpse into this life. She sounded like a fascinating woman. Unfortunately, she died at 36 of uterine cancer. But
Too early.
yeah, exactly, 100%. Because it seemed like she had her fingers on the pulse of what the computers could be, and it's nice to see that there's someone who is really revolutionary in their thought, be able to say something and really create thoughts that were so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting about it is the fact that we cover a lot of different women used to like women on the podcast, especially with Paleo Futures. But one thing is that they all seem to have like died earlier, like than what we can you imagine what she would have been able to accomplish if she had lived longer? I mean, one thing, just building off of what you said, I think she was probably one of the first futurists too, because she talked about metaphysics and she challenged the status quo of what could be done, especially around this idea of technology and coding. I think that one thing that really just made her who she was also we have to look at her upbringing, because because she was the child of a famous man, of a man of means. She got her education from a very early age. She was being taught by some of the premier people in the fields that she eventually ended up studying in and talking about. So I think that that's something that really is it's a shame that she only lived to be 36, like when we already said, because I think that she would have been able to contribute so much more to at least the thought. And because computers were, coming into existence, 50, 60, 70 years later. So it's not like it was, it was completely out of her purview that, she could have been alive when those things were starting to be created.
Absolutely. I mean, it was only 100 years ago that 100 years later, maybe, less than that, 80 years later, that, you have Alan Turing, eventually, von Neumann, and then, we had going all the way into the mother of all demos, which was another paleo futures that we had, right? Like there's a succession. And that's what Walter Isaacson's The Innovators is all about. It's about really the history of technology and computational power. And Ada is the number one story in there. And sort of that's what made me want to dive deeper into her, into her life story. So I think it's great to bring up the fact that she was indeed not only a revolutionary, but also that education plays a part in futures, right? You got to know about this stuff. You got to touch it. And I think that's the other thing, right? We talk about being a futurist. She touched it, right? She did the coding. She saw what was out there. And I think that's what probably makes folks like even Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos or a Bill Gates that much better at being able to see what the future holds, right? Or a Ray Kurzweil, right? One of the most famous futurists in the world. These are coders, right? They get their hands dirty. They know what the capability, how you can go from just a little line of code to changing, the world. So just because you know how to do it, and like I said, you've gotten your hands dirty. So I think it's great to bring her voice onto the podcast. I think it's great to bring her expression, and all hats to Ada for showing us the future of the computational world.
Want some money?
All right, folks, it's time for FizBiz.
FizBiz, do it.
Yeah. So we're going to take a bit of a different tune here on FizBiz today. So there's not going to be any corny catchphrases. We're not going to say any puns, no disclaimers, no LOL phrases or clever double entendres. At least according to our attorneys, we don't have to do that this time. Instead, today we're going to talk about money, specifically something that is on 90% of the bills throughout the United States. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is drugs. More specifically, cocaine, for that example.
Awesome.
But even more, but even more specifically in this FizBiz, we're going to talk about the legalization of drugs here in the United States and around the world, and the financial and societal impacts it has when drugs become decriminalized or even legalized. So the reason that we're bringing this topic up is because some of the news that came out of the recent election, actually out of Mexico, newly elected Andrés Manuel López Obrador recently stated that he is stated now that he is president of Mexico, that he would like to legalize all drugs in the country. I cannot stress how big of a deal this is. I mean, this is a huge deal. While Mexico would not be the first country to do this, that's actually something we'll get to later. It is the first country that is so close to the United States and has such an impact on the United States that could potentially do so. It may actually also be the largest country to ever do this. And if this happens, this could affect all of us here in the United States. So I won't take our listeners down a very long and complicated history of the war on drugs in the United States, which some people, date all the way back to like 1912. But let's just leave it at the issue that the United States has spent billions of dollars, had multitude of lives lost trying to fight the crimes associated with drug sales, and it incarcerates over 1 million people a year due to drug-related activities. So meanwhile, in Mexico, the U.S.-backed war on drugs has done little to stem the violence since Mexican troops were deployed to the streets in December of 2006. So a report that came out in 2016 actually stated that the United States war on drug has been a complete failure. And in Mexico, though some of the larger cartels have been broken up and their leaders arrested, this has actually only served to fragment the power. And it's set dozens of smaller gangs against one another in a vicious battle for control of territory. So in 2017, almost 29,000 people were killed in Mexico. That's the highest number since records have been kept, and a huge part of the reason that Obrador was elected. This year is on course to be even more lethal, with the death toll expected to pass 30,000 people. This recent round of local and federal elections actually even saw more than 100 office holders or candidates murdered as cartels sought to influence the results. I don't know if you saw that in the news, Chris, but that was all over Mexico, and it didn't seem like they were talking enough about it here in the United States. But overall, more than 200,000 Mexicans have been killed since 2006 on the war on drugs. So that's a huge amount of people just killed because of drug warfare, basically. So the government could actually, and the reason we're bringing this up on FizBiz too, because this has a financial impact. So the government could actually save huge amounts of money if it gave up trying to enforce drug laws. That's here in the United States and other places. By stopping the drug war, efforts and resources could be reoriented toward pursuing crimes that actually affect the Mexican population, a recent politician said, like extortion, kidnapping, rape, all things that are instead of victimless crimes like drug possession or transportation of drugs, which is most often geared toward drugs out of the country, it can focus on these realistic, serious crimes that affect the average population. They can also refocus efforts to stopping guns at the U.S. side of the border, because believe it or not, drugs flow over to the United States and guns flow from the United States over to Mexico. Because in Mexico, it's actually illegal to have guns, and people don't even realize that. It's illegal in Mexico for anyone to own a gun. Yeah, the government does little to stop this massive illegal importation that's seeping through the border because they're trying so hard to stop the drugs first. So I wanted to bring up a couple of countries that have taken various, sides of this drug warfare approach, and I'll bring up some facts and figures. But I think that I'm sure you've heard of, Chris, because we've talked about this before, and I want to bring this up, and then I'm going to pass it to you because I know you have a lot to say about this. So one thing, yeah, I know you do, man. This is something we've talked about a lot. So one country I want to bring up, and this is the only other country in the world that has all legalized drugs. That is the country of Portugal. So all drugs were actually decriminalized in 2001 after a serious issue of 1% of the entire population being addicted to heroin and a rise of AIDS-related diagnoses and diseases from dirty needles, etc. So in many ways, this decriminalization has had a lot of positive effects in Portugal. Drug-related deaths in Portugal are now the second lowest in the European Union. Just 3 out of every million people die of overdoses there, which is compared with the rest of the EU average of 17.3 people per million. If someone is found in the possession of less than a 10-day supply of anything from marijuana to heroin, he or she is not sent to prison. They're sent to a 3-person commission for dissuading them for drug addiction, typically made up of a lawyer, a doctor, and a social worker. The commission recommends treatment or a minor fine. Otherwise, the person is sent off without any penalty. So a vast majority of the time, there is no penalty. 14 years after decriminalization, Portugal has not been run into the ground by a nation of drug addicts like so many people predicted. In fact, by many measures, it's doing far better than it was before. The reason for Portugal's policy, I'm going to get a little bit into history here. I promise I won't take too much of the time. But so Portugal's policy started in the 1970s when it overthrew its dictatorship and took steps towards being a democracy. With the opening of its borders, drugs came flooding in from expatriates and other countries moving drugs through Portugal because it's a coastal state that easy to get into Europe. So it actually became so bad that the government decided to do much what the United States is currently doing and having a war on drugs. It used force and scare tactics to try and remove the drugs in the 1980s and 90s. However, after not finding much success with these policies, it decided to do the completely opposite way. While there was an initial increase in drug usage in 2001, the usage has dropped steadily over the past 17 years. Drug use has declined overall amongst the people who are most vulnerable to drug usage, the 15 to 24-year-old population. So that's a huge issue. And there's also been a decline in the percentage of the population who have ever used a drug and continue to do so. Yet it's a point that decriminalization of drugs is not the only thing that has contributed to these numbers. Like I brought up before, turn of the millennium, Portugal shifted drug control from the Justice Department to the Ministry of Health, instituted a robust public health model for treating hard drug addiction. It also expanded the welfare system in the form of a guaranteed minimum income. Changes in the material and health resources for at-risk populations for the past decade are a major factor in evaluating the evolution of Portugal's drug situation. So it was policies too. I want to bring up 3 or 4 other countries, and then I'm going to get into the United States. And this is going to be an interesting thing that you and I are going to talk about a lot, Chris. So the Netherlands legalized marijuana. It states that it doesn't prosecute individuals with small amounts of soft drugs. So if you're out found on the street, they don't really care if as long as it's a soft drug. They haven't legalized anything that would consider a hard drug like heroin or anything like that. Uruguay legalized marijuana in 2013. It became the first country to ever do so. And actually, drug possession for personal use has been decriminalized since 1974. Yeah, and that applies to all drugs. Consumers of marijuana have to register with the government, but they're also allowed to grow their own drugs in like cannabis clubs. They make their own, they have like a group where they just grow these things. Switzerland in 1986 became the first country to open shelters for drug addicts. It also has injection rooms and needle exchanges to help addicts. Instead of leading to a proliferation of intravenous drug use, a 2006 study found that the country has few new heroin users, and before it had the largest HIV rates in Western Europe, and now it has one of the lowest. Canada. So obviously this year, Canada decided to become the first major country, the first G7 country anyway, to legalize recreational marijuana usage. This is an interesting aspect of that law is that they allow each territory to decide how they're going to implement that. So it's crazy that you can actually so you can have up to 30 grams of marijuana on you for personal use, which is a lot of marijuana. And you can actually grow up to 4 plants for personal use. That's the federal law. But then the territories, like some of them allow like marijuana will be able to be sold at grocery stores. Some of them only have like 40 registered places where you can actually buy them. So that's Canada and that's Mexico. So let's talk about the United States just real quick, and then I'm going to pass it over to you, Chris. So there's 9 states in the United States which allow recreational marijuana, and 30 states allow medicinal marijuana. The tax revenues in these states fund many programs in the state, and that depend on that tax income for to fund a lot of different social programs, kindergartner programs. Like it's really interesting. So for example, when Oregon first legalized marijuana in January of 2016, they expected, they'd make maybe $3 to $4 million of extra tax revenue for that year due to the sale of the drug. However, after the month of January, it became evident that it gained $3.48 million in January alone, more than what they thought they would make for the entire year. It's 2 serious issues. 46% of prisoners in the United States are in prison due to drug-related crime. And mandatory minimum sentences for 1 gram of a substance like LSD or 5 grams of crack cocaine lead to a 5-year sentence without parole. So we have some of the harshest drug penalties in the world, and we're spending billions of dollars, trillions of dollars over the life of a war on drugs to combat it, and we're still having these huge impacts on our society. So, Chris, take it away, man. Tell me all your views on this, because I know you've got a lot.
Yeah. No. I think you hit on a couple right important topics, right? One is just the economic, right? We're talking about FizBiz. This is future business, the future of business. The economics of the drug war have made no sense. Maybe they've enriched the prison or the people who make prisons and run prisons. Maybe they've enriched people who create guns and make bullets. Obviously, cops and drug enforcement folks want to keep their numbers high. But in terms of what has happened to whole swathes of people who have been wrapped up in this and their drug usage and or even low level drug crimes, and in terms it messes up whole communities, especially minority communities here in the United States. I think that's a real tragedy. And I think we forget, right? We always talk about the growth rates and where we need to go in the United States and around the world, and how, in some ways, the same social credit systems that we were talking about, if you have been wrapped up in a felony because of a low-level drug offense and you were prosecuted in the 80s or 90s, with long sentences, you have not only wrecked your life, but you've probably wrecked your children's life, everybody around you, and you have whole communities that can't have an impact on the economy and society. And actually, that's to me, I think that's regrettable, and that's something that America should take a hard look in. I think additionally too, when we talk about drug usage, I think drugs is really a poor term. Some of these quote unquote drugs are obviously bad for you, but I think decriminalization is really the most important thing. Legalization versus decriminalization, I think there's a clear distinction, and we should make that. But decriminalization, period, is the right route, and I think Portugal has definitely implemented the decriminalization with some real positive effects. Now, of course, you already see some of this decriminalization working not only in the post-medical marijuana, post-marijuana legalization America, but inside cities where they still have marijuana, anti-marijuana laws in. It's being pretty much decriminalized, right? Slap on a hand, they throw away the marijuana. They're not going to put you in jail for it. You'll get a fine, and this is happening all over the country. And I think people are waking up and seeing that we can't do this. Not only can we not degrade our society, but we can't afford to put all these people in jail for these low level offenses that are hurting society in a myriad of different ways. I think we've also talked about this on one of our early podcasts where we talked about quote unquote drug usage when it comes to the mind and using psychedelics such as MDMA, using psychedelics like ketamine, ayahuasca, ibogaine to help with an innumerable amount of things, to include PTSD, addictions like alcohol addiction, heroin addiction, these sorts of things. So I think there's definitely an awakening happening in society where drugs aren't seen as this kind of amorphous, like, don't do drugs and these are bad. Anything you put in your body is a drug. Coffee is a drug. The most abused drug on earth is caffeine.
Yep.
You ingest it and you use it to better ideate and speak. Some people need their coffee in the morning. It's a need, right, that people have. Anything that you put in your system can change your consciousness, as can drugs. And I think we have to take a more scientific approach rather than this very punitive, kind of short-sighted, like we find this as a societal evil. Actually, some of these things are pretty mind-blowing. A lot of the top thinkers, not only in the computational movement, but really in terms of art and music and movies, and I mean even even presidents, right? Barack Obama smoked marijuana. Supposedly, George Bush did, and I think in some ways too, I think we're in a new era where it's okay, right? So. Obviously, I don't want my state senator, my senator, or even my doctor or or the truck driver, behind me smoking marijuana before they do their jobs, right? Because it sort of takes you away from your capability. But also don't want to throw that same doctor, that state senator, that senator in jail because they came home and wanted to have a beer or wanted to have some wine or wanted to, smoke a joint or wanted to go have a ibogaine session for XYZ reason in Costa Rica. We shouldn't view drugs as this big, huge, horrible thing, because there's a chance that it actually can help society. And also, the punitive stuff doesn't seem to be really helping. And if anything, it seems to be making it a lot worse.
Well, and I'll finish this section off by quoting from the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which released a report on June 2nd, 2011, which alleged that the war on drugs has failed. It's cost countries like Mexico billions to trillions of dollars a year to fight criminal activity related to criminal gangs, drug enforcement, and imprisonment of millions of people due to drug-related usage. So in the end, by successfully implementing drug programs that allow people to use these drugs, turn them away from using them in the first place, not through legal means, but through mental health programs and programs designed to help people, not hurt them, it can be shown that taxation of drugs like marijuana can lead to significant tax revenues and the reduction of drug-related arrests and criminal activities. And so when I look at a country like Mexico, as it attempts to legalize drugs, and I wonder, will it be successful? I think only time will tell. And when the countries that border the United States to the north and the south have legalized drugs, I wonder what the United States will do. And I hope that we can see drug addiction as a mental health issue and not as an issue that is related to and needs to be penalized with jail time. Because I think that's what Barack Obama was trying to do before he left office. He was trying to say, look, these are nonviolent people who were dealing drugs or doing drugs, and it's those. If you're thinking from a Republican sense, even it makes sense not to have these people in jail because it costs like $45,000 or like between $30,000 and $45,000 a year for one person in a prison. So if we're incarcerating 1 million people a year, that's a lot of money that's being paid by the taxpayers to put these people behind bars when they could be contributing members of society. And that's what I'm hoping that we can do, just like a country like Portugal, which I know we're not Portugal, we're very different. But if we could do something like this to really, have this mental health side of things and to dissuade people from using drugs, but not to penalize them for it, I think that would be ultimately a successful thing that I would love to see.
Okay, great. So for the interview segment of the podcast, we have Jake Dunagan. Dunagan, is that how we pronounce it?
That's it, Dunagan.
Okay, cool. So Jake's an experiential futurist, governance designer, and teacher. He directs the Governance Future Labs at the IFTF. That's the Institute for the Future, right?
Yep.
And then so his work has been centered on the concept of social invention and novel methods to help individuals, organizations, governing institutions reimagine and reinvent the future. Recent projects include the future of social entrepreneurship, applied embodied cognition, judicial foresight, kids technologies, intellectual property law, service innovation, and the future of work. Jake holds a PhD from the University of Hawaii Manoa with a focus in neuropolitics, governance, design, and communication of foresight. He has a master's from Temple University and a BA from Auburn University in anthropology of visual communication. And he's currently an adjunct professor of design strategy at the MBA program at the California College of Arts, where he teaches strategic foresight, tactile media, and social invention, and also an international mentor for the De Sueño de Mañana program at Centro in Mexico City. So that is just quite the mouthful, Jake. Thanks a lot for coming on to Some Future. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Cool, man. So, this is actually a really timely conversation. Jack and I actually, and pardon me, Jack's not here, so I'm going to be doing this solo, but it's okay. We'll hold down to 4 for you, Jack. But Jack and I have been spending really the last couple episodes kind of talking about government and, sort of the future of government and where we see it, where we not see it. I think this is on a lot of folks' minds. Obviously, if you look at some books that have been coming out, the one by Madeleine Albright, about, the end of democracy or on tyranny, by Timothy Snyder. There's definitely some alarm bells. But that being said, there's actually a lot of really great work happening at the local level. And I think that's, where your work comes in. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about your work when it comes to, the future of, I guess, the local community, and in specifics, maybe the future of mayors and how, they can work to achieve, real futures in their work.
Yeah, let me answer that. Hopefully not in a too circuitous way. I'm gonna be pithy for the podcast, but
No problem.
First entree into this kind of thinking came from a book called Quantum Politics, which I had encountered by luck when I was at Auburn, and it was a series of thought experiments saying, what if we redesigned our systems of government not on Newtonian mechanics, but on the latest physics, quantum physics, so observers can change reality, and we can never really know with certainty all of the pieces of any situation fully, measurement effects and all of those things that are embedded in reality. So what if we designed our systems based on those assumptions, as opposed to the world works like a machine or a clock, and you just turn the handle and everything. If you design it well, you turn the handle, turn the crank, and good government comes out of it, good decisions. So that was really inspiring to me. That's how I ended up going to University of Hawaii. So governance design, really political systems thinking has been really a deep interest of mine for many years now. So that has been a thread throughout. And then in early 2013, when I was living in California, I came to Austin, went to a conference called Is America Governable? And this was very much a constitutional law professor kind of meeting in Brookings Institute, and very much the more mainstream way of thinking, not this radical University of Hawaii political systems kind of approach with quantum politics and all of that. This was very much, the establishment, intellectual establishment. And basically their conclusion out of 2 or 3 days of this conference was no. And this is 2013, right? This is, they were seeing a lot of the toxic effects of demagoguery and how the system was breaking down. And, so it was not surprising that Trump emerged for me, and I think for a lot of people, because of the systematic failures of our governing systems that weren't representing people, that had all of these embedded kind of systems failure to a more autocratic kind of system. So thinking about this as kind of a design approach, structurally, you could see the foundations crumbling from a long time period away. So those things were kind of seminal in creating the Governance Futures Lab, which we did at the Institute for the Future. And our goal was to try to empower people to think of themselves as social inventors, to really get them to own the fact that we're going to have to redesign our political systems because they're failing, right? Because they're mechanistic and they don't reflect reality appropriately, but also that we have all these new tools that we can use. We're connected as a globe more than we ever have been. Obviously, we've seen the weaponization of disinformation and memes and all of that happen recently, but there is still potential to create new kinds of government that we never could before because of technical limitations or time and space and all of those things. So I'm working around to this point about local mayors. Recently, in the last 6 months or so, I've been working with U.S. mayors through the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We had an event at South by Southwest a few months ago where we trained mayors on futures techniques and also had them do artifacts from the future. So we had U.S. mayors, in that case, about 20 of them, creating tangible artifacts from the future of their cities. And then we just recently ran another workshop in Boston with the U.S. Conference of Mayors at their large annual meeting, had another 30 mayors. And they're really responding to this foresight approach. It's kind of shocking and maybe slightly disturbing that they don't have these kind of thinking skills. I mean, they're making these critical decisions at the local level, but they're soaking it up. And so seeing how useful foresight is to mayors, and I think that's where I'm putting my hope in. Not necessarily the anarchic global government, not the kind of failing demagoguery-based national government that we have, but mayors of both parties, right? I have my own value system, my own politics, but I was working with mayors from both parties who I appreciated and who they can't be ideological. If you've got to fill potholes and pick up garbage, you can't just talk, right? On the other hand, they're holding the visions of their cities. So the scale of cities, I think, and a lot of people have made this point, but it just has become even clearer to me in the last couple of years that that's where our trajectory forward is going to be is generally at a network of cities, and that city scale is where effective government and governance can happen. So you go for a vision. All of these mayors, keep Austin weird. There's a story to each city, right? But there's also a practicality to it, street by street, person by person, that a mayor can't just sort of go off and do things. They're held accountable in a way that I think some of our national politicians can get away with. So that's where I've begun to direct a lot of my attention and hope, as I said, is to try to empower local leaders, mayors, and local citizens to really get their cities and get their localities sorted out. And then let's scale those and let's network with other ones that are doing positive things as well. So a long answer, I know, but I think it's important to give that context of why, where it come from, the kind of design thinking approach to it, and empowering social inventors to work, and working at that scale, I think, is where we should focus.
Absolutely. Well, we'll focus on that for sure, because I do have some questions, obviously, around mayors in the future. But later on, if I have time, I might dig into a little bit of that University of Hawaii work, because that sounds pretty fantastic. But let's focus right now, at exactly the topic at hand, what you were discussing, right? There are a lot of challenges, I think, that are happening, globally, locally, regionally. Economically, it's a tough time in the world. Not everywhere, but there are a lot of insane dynamics that are happening, steep dynamics that are changing how cities, how countries, how companies, how groups are being affected. And I think I agree with you that mayors have a unique position because of the growth of cities, and the fact that we're going to have these super metropolises all around the world. Just think of China, right? There's going to be as many as 20 to possibly 30 cities in the next 10 to 20 years that are going to be over 10 million people. That's 20 to 30 New York cities. That's an amazing statistic.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask what are some of the biggest challenges that you think that today's mayors face right now? And then, and I think, you were alluding to this. Why should mayors think like futurists?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the litany of things I'm about to spout off are pretty well known, right?
Sure.
I mean, I'm down the road I'm in Austin. I'm down the road from Houston. Last year, the most water ever dumped on a city in history, as we've ever been able to measure. Great, you have a city plan for the city of Houston, and all of a sudden you get this massive weather event. So, we've had those every 2, 3, 5, 10 years, these kind of major events. Okay, last year, 4 or 5 of them, right? I think we're gonna be getting hit repetitively and punched in the face left and right. And the recovery, a J.J. Watt raising $20 million, you can't do that every 2 weeks, right? It's just not going to be possible to have the resilience to deal with that. So I think, coastal cities, sure, but everywhere, mayors are going to have to be dealing with climate issues. And, look at Puerto Rico. Can we really rely on the federal government to actually come in? It's going to, it's politically driven, and it's, the resources are going to dry up. Even if there's goodwill toward it, there's not necessarily going to be the resilience built into the system where we're going to blow through our buffer of finances and energy to do that. So I think that's a huge one. Being down here in Texas, also immigration, city versus state and federal legal preemption. This is something that I'm really interested in, is especially for a liberal city like Austin in a very red state like Texas. almost all of the progressive laws that we try to enact, not even progressive, just nowadays it's almost carte blanche. Anything we try to do here, there's a pushback from the state level. So obviously with immigration and sanctuary cities, that's a very political issue. We've seen it in Charlotte with the bathroom bill, transgender bathroom bills that get pushed back, plastic bag bans that states are that conservative states are getting pushed by lobbyists to overrule cities. So that, I think, is a really interesting one that also condenses a lot of different dynamics. So every issue, right, from immigration to environment, local policies that are specific for a certain place are being preempted at national and state level. So that dynamic, I think, is going to be really, really interesting to play out. And for me, Austin is ground zero of that, where the pushback between levels of government are going to get very strong. The cleavages and the tensions are going to keep rising. Our one here was Uber and Lyft, right? We had a regulation on how they do background checks, which Uber and Lyft said, we don't want to do that. That ruins our business model. So they left. A local nonprofit rideshare company emerged. Everything was kind of cool for us. Worked the same. Money stayed here. There was a lot of charity that was going out. Local drivers got paid. But Uber and Lyft lobbied at the state level to make our regulation illegal statewide. So I think that's going to be a critical issue as well. Just the main stuff: environment, economics, pollution, and those kind of issues. Immigration are huge. Again, not just at coastal cities or border towns, but I think all over the country.
Sure. Yeah. And so then, what are the skill sets or the tools that you're helping to teach these mayors to tackle these different, dynamics, this multipolar, problems that are going to be coming, whether it is a flood or whether it is a surge of immigration due to a famine like Syria, or due to war, because keep in mind too, we're not just talking about North American cities. We're talking about mayors of every city, from South Africa to the, even Pakistan. Pakistan's going to have these huge mega cities like Karachi. And how is somebody who is the mayor of 30 million people, going to dictate everything from, war and famine to, dealing with trade policies with China? It's going to be extremely difficult. So I'm wondering, what are the tools and what are the frameworks and things that you're helping teach mayors so they can go out there and be successful and possibly think like futurists?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we are trying to do is not, as and I'll talk to many futurists, we're not trying to predict a single future. That's one thing, right? I mean, is to help them understand that we're looking at a range of branching possibility states that now are more volatile and uncertain than ever. I mean, imagine if you're a mayor of a city in Ohio, Trump spouts off on Twitter, starts the trade war with China. They don't just make blanket tariffs. They're targeting Trump states, right? So you're a mayor in an industrial city in Ohio, and all of a sudden your main industries are getting targeted because of, this back and forth at a national level. So that kind of global view that these kind of things that may be happening halfway across the world will affect you in small town Ohio, and then the volatility of that. If we could just get mayors and other leaders and people in general to think linearly, okay, demographics. You're going to have in Austin another 1 million people. You're going to need this many more roads, this many more, police and services and all of those things. That's hard enough. Generally, people don't even do that well. the linear changes, the things that we know, these big, as Jim Dater would say, the big tsunamis of change that we know are coming. Mm-hmm. A 1 million person city a week in China, right? Like we can see these things coming globally, but even city to city, we know that there are going to be these issues, the knowns, and those things are even hard to get mayors and other leaders to make proper decisions on those. So I'm baby stepping it for just get smart about those things. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there are massive, volatile, nonlinear kinds of changes. We've just gone through a couple of examples where a trade war, a tweet could spark a cascading set of decisions that impact your city, a small city in Texas or Utah or Ohio. And then you have the weather events as well. So, getting them a good foundation of just understanding the tsunamis of change, the linear big shifts that are happening, but hopefully then also having them be able to think through nonlinear cascading implications, second, third order implications of things, and then get ahead of it. We're making laws for self-driving cars and things. It's very reactive. Getting ahead of it 10 years ago, learning when the stakes are lower and the costs are lower, because all of this stuff is going to take experimentation. We're not going to get it all right. And so policies that are done early stage where we can learn without it being so painful as to affect, 500,000 people or to ruin an industry because you didn't make the right call because you are reacting to the news of the day. And those kinds of things, I think, are destructive. So those are the kinds of thought processes using the tools from Futures that we want them to understand, is to understand the S-curve, get ahead of it early, experiment, learn while the stakes are a little bit lower and the costs are a little bit lower. And so we're not in a reactive mode all the time.
So when you think of mayors, right, and I just kind of alluded to it too in my comment about being the mayor of Karachi, or even being the mayor of a place like New York City, like Bill de Blasio, or LA, these sort of super cities, Houston, right, just down the street from you there. These are large metropolises, a lot of stuff happening all at the same time. Like you said, we now live in sort of a global environment where local is now global and can be affected by global. It means that mayors really are true future, they're leaders, not only of their small area, but maybe they also have an impact on the world with what they do. Maybe even perhaps more so than a prime minister or a president or another governing body official. Wondering what you think of the power dynamic of being a mayor or being a small not a small town, but a leader of just a group of people, and how much impact that has on the world. Are mayors possibly the new prime ministers? Are they the new presidents of the world? Just wondering what you think about that concept.
Yeah, I think so. Just given some of the structural failures of governments at national levels, not all are dysfunctional, but just being in the U.S., it just seems, so present for us. Yeah, that this researcher and writer Bruce Katz, who talks about network government, has a great quote. He says basically the reins of the future are being handed over to mayors. So long-term futures are being shrunk seemingly at a national and global level. So mayors have to take that responsibility. And so getting smart about their decision-making processes, getting foresight embedded into councils and mayoral level decisions, I think is it's what's happening. It's being handed. It wasn't some kind of, oh yeah, we're gonna do this. That's the level of responsibility that seemingly is where the buck is stopping. And so a city of 20 million people is bigger than all of Scandinavia, right? So the scale of these cities, if you start putting people together, as you know, we're mostly urban planet now. You start putting together the numbers of human beings, and mayors cover them. There's these overlay of other kind of governments, but if a consortium of mayors got together and wanted to make policy collectively, that could be globally impactful, and it could, in many ways, usurp or skid around some of the dysfunctional non-decision making and negative kinds of decision making happening at national levels, and then the no decision at a global level, which is another issue, right? We have basically global anarchy, UN aside. It's not really a functioning system there as well.
Sure. And so I see mayors coming into this, sort of leadership vacuum because of, the entropy at the very large network systems. It's getting maybe too difficult, right, to control these large global systems, and then you see mayors maybe coming at it. They're managing their own huge systems, right? I mean, 5 million people is a lot of people, and that's a lot of moving parts, right? But you can imagine Tokyo or Mexico City or Beijing or some of these super cities that are about to prop up in the next 20 years. They have a lot going on, just like the prime ministers and presidents of the world, or even the leaders of corporations such as IBM, who I work for, or Exxon Mobil. So there's a lot of dynamics happening when it comes to these folks that are putting these leadership positions. And I'm wondering what you may comment on. Stuart Candy, I know who you know. He says foresight is a leadership competency. Do you believe this? Do you believe foresight and or futures work is necessary to be a mayor or leader of a group like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether trained or untrained, you've got to look ahead. I mean, humans are, as the philosopher Andy Clark says, we're prediction machines. We're always running through simulations, whether it's, should I talk to this person whom I'm attracted to and make an offer, right? You go through simulations at every level of our lives. Should I eat this food? Should I invest in that? So we are prediction machines. The issue is that we're often not very good at it. And so, yeah, foresight is absolutely essential for human existence, right? To be able to know what we're doing next. So way broader than even mayoral decision-making processes. But on the other hand, leaders have to have that as well. And not only have to have foresight, I think what Stuart's saying there and what we all, I think, believe is that the foresight capacity, the ability to think better about the future and improve your capacity for understanding dynamics of change, that has to be embedded in the office of the mayor, but in the institutions of government and governance. So absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think understanding cascading implications of change, doing simple things like futures wheel, where you look at, okay, if I make this decision, then that happens. If that happens, then the next thing happens. So looking second, third order implications of decisions ahead of time, running through simulations of possible outcomes of decisions, that kind of stuff. We can't just go guessing forward, and we can't, just try to think, oh, because my beliefs or my constituents want this, that's going to work out best. And I think for government, there's an inherent bias towards nearer term outcomes because of the election cycle. And you have a structural issue where if you have a 10-year plan where there's 3 or 4 or 5 years of pain before you start seeing some of the benefits, you're out of office. So there are structural biases towards nearer term outcomes, and nearer term outcomes can often steal possibility space from the future, steal opportunities from the future. You're basically using it up to try to serve the present. So, I think there's a structural issue as well about how we run elections, how a long-term decision-making process can be embedded in it that doesn't incentivize short-term thinking. So there's the structural issues, and then the psychological issues of foresight as well. How do we think better? How do we understand decision-making processes and cascading implications in a way psychologically that improves our thinking process? So both of those things, I think, are essential to look at as elements of intervention or design.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good point too. And to me, when you have that lens, that enables the possibility for better governance. What I'm wondering though, and I think you're the perfect person to ask this because you've been getting your fingers dirty there, at the local level, trying to teach this stuff and see if we make it happen. What is not only the reception of this sort of work embedded into governance, but now that you see it, right? You're part of the sausage making, or you're at least viewing what the sausage making is. You get to see the sausage makers in action. What do you think the future of democracy holds? How do you feel about this? Obviously, I want you to be political. I know you've been working with these folks, and obviously you just said doesn't matter party, doesn't matter political spectrum. You actually really believe in these folks and what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, just generally, where, this is something that Jack and I have been talking about for the past, 2 months, like I said. How does the future of democracy look like to you at this very moment, especially since you're right neck deep in it?
Yeah. So there's what I think is going to happen and what I want to happen, and those two things are different, unfortunately.
Of course.
I think we're in a very fraught period for democracy. The rise of autocracy and kind of totalitarian, non-democratic institutions rising is strong. And one of the things in America that have been thinking about, one of our challenges is, if you look at every institution of our lives, and I'm generalizing, right? So families, schools, sports teams, military, churches, nothing is democratic, right? I mean, the head of household, I rule this roost. I'm the coach of the team. You listen to me. God and Jesus are the kings that you should follow. And, there's a very father figure kind of model for that. Schools generally still run by a teacher who holds authority. So we have an authoritarian guts and a democratic veneer at the top level. And so it's not surprising that we don't understand how democracy works, or that a strongman model would appeal to us, because for most of us, the institutions of our lives, that's what we're comfortable with, or that's what we're used to, for better or worse. So I think finding a way to make democracy and kind of democratic processes that are more, and I didn't even mention companies, right, run by CEOs, and you have a boss, and I know there's different models emerging, but what I fear is that we don't even know how democracy works. We don't really understand it, and so when we lose it, we're more comfortable with these kind of authoritarian models, because that's what we experience throughout our lives. So it's to me a generational scale problem, where we need to embed holographically democratic kinds of thinking throughout our institutions, from the family up. But in the meantime, I fear that we're not strong enough to hold the line. Hopefully, our history, our myths, our stories about the benefits of democracy will allow us to hold on to that. Because I do believe in democracy, or at least I believe that decisions that affect you should have a say in. Right now, there may be different ways to organize that. Things like liquid democracy, where you can give proxy votes to certain people or pull it back. We can have direct democracy. There's a lot of opportunities for democracy that haven't been explored yet. And another point about local government versus larger scale is that these experiments in different ways of making decisions collectively, distributing resources, I think they're going to happen at local levels. And I think we're going to have to get on it. So, part of what I want to do at the Governance Futures Lab is to try to catalyze new structures of government, and then experiment with them actively and urgently to say, okay, which things are working, which are not working. Participatory budgeting, that's been tried in certain places. Let's learn how that works, where it fails. Let's learn quickly, because if we don't have an alternative, people are going to go back to the thing that they're used to, which, as I was saying, is more autocratic, I'm afraid. So that conflict, or that kind of bifurcation of democracy not existing at other levels, but yet we want to hold on to it at a national level, I think we got to figure out a way to get democratic thinking more embedded in our everyday lives and our institutions that we create and experience.
So, yeah, and you said some words there that I think are really interesting, right? Things like, liquid democracy. Earlier you said quantum politics. You're talking about there are different types of democracies that are out there. And I know, we don't have another 2 hours, right, to talk on this, but I'm wondering if you could just give us a couple examples of what are the types of democracies that we aren't even thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, I think liquid democracy is a early example where we can take back. I mean, it sort of builds out of a base of direct democracy, right? The reason why we have representatives, well, one side of the story is that in the colonial times, we can't all get in a horse and buggy and go to the city to vote or go to Washington to vote. So we need proxies, right? It was a practical thing. The other side of that is that the leaders didn't want the people. They didn't want direct democracy because of demagoguery and mob rule and some of the things, the oppression that kind of model could do. So they wanted to limit it to the best and brightest from each state and each locality to come and vote. But now, okay, so either one of those aside, we really honestly have all of the pieces of the puzzle to do direct democracy if we wanted to do that. Like, people could vote on issues that they want to. But the practical thing is, even in once out of every 4 years, we only get 50%, 60% sometimes to go out and vote. It's difficult to do that, or people don't want to do that, or whatever. So instead of expecting people to vote on every issue, which they wouldn't know, if there's an immigration law, maybe I don't know that. If there's some new science regulation or intellectual property law, people aren't going to know everything. Even our representatives don't know everything. That's another structural problem, is how could they possibly understand these issues enough to make decisions on them. So liquid democracy says that, okay, I've got my vote and I can use it if I want to, but I could also give it by proxy to someone else who I believe in. So I got a marine biologist friend. Anything with the ocean or environmental issues, I would trust him to vote properly on my behalf. And so liquid democracy allows you to maintain the autonomy over your vote, and I could take it back anytime I want. But in the meantime, I give it out to a person or certain sets of people and let them do the voting. And that gives a lot more flexibility than 435 or whatever people voting in Washington over these big issues that, they represent 300,000 people. And that scale, it's impossible, right? Even if you are doing your best to know every issue and to really represent your constituents in an honest way is nearly impossible. So these models that allow more flexibility, more granular kind of voting, a way to proxy your vote, but also maintain that control over it, I think there's a lot of potential in that space, which we're early stage of that, and there's been some issues with liquid democracy about it actually functioning. But if we want to maintain democracy, I think we're going to have to try out some of these things. And that's, again, I've mentioned it before, but that's one of my big motivations, is getting new ideas on the table and then trying them out and doing it in a hurry. I was really influenced by the Arab Spring and, unfortunately, the failure of it. And I think part of the failure of it was that, okay, we tear down these dictators and these autocratic regimes. What do you got to replace it? A presidential system from the U.S., a parliamentary system. Those things have their issues, and it's not surprising we've gone back to autocracy or theocracy, because the alternatives weren't really there. And so what are we gonna choose? Yeah, let's choose something else. But there really wasn't a great alternative in many cases. I know I'm simplifying, but just if I'm sitting there like, what do I put in that's new in 21st century? There just didn't seem to be a lot there. So I think we all, and this is back to democracy, not just of voting, but of creation. What kind of governments do we want, and how can we all have a say in designing those collectively? That's a big part of what I'd like to do as well, is create participatory systems for governance design, not just casting a vote for a system that's already been predetermined. I think that's the stage we're at. We need a renaissance of governance design collectively.
Fantastic, and that's why we're really glad that you're doing the good work there at the Governor's Future Lab by the Institute for the Future. So, hey Jake, so do you got anything to plug? We're coming up the end here, so I'm just wondering if you have any future work or work that you're working on that you want to point to our audience so they can get a view of what you're doing in real time.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally pay attention to what we're trying to do at the Institute and the U.S. Conference of Mayors work and the Governance Futures Lab. I mean, as I said, creating participatory systems is great. We need participants. So, finding these opportunities where we can get people involved in thinking about governance design. We have a toolkit called the Social Inventors Toolkit that we created a few years ago. That's a step-by-step process to lead people through a governance design facilitated process, step-by-step. I'd love to see people take that up. It exists. It's online. It's free. It's Creative Commons. People can take it on, called the Social Inventors Toolkit. And then just want to plug the research we're doing at the Institute around the future of trust. That's our big umbrella research agenda for the year, is we call it Trust on Trial. So looking at how institutions of government, business, how trust is being won and lost in those spaces. We're looking at disinformation and memes and how fake news and all of that is sowing distrust and mistrust throughout our institutions and media. And then also even the neurobiology of trust. How does trust work on our brains and biology in our bodies? And so I really like that work. I think it's obviously super relevant. And, the Institute is a nonprofit, so almost all of our work is released publicly available. So pay attention to that, get in there and find ways to be involved in your own communities. I think this bartender in New York just won primary, that's so inspirational. I think we're, that's what the remaining hope in my cynic's heart is, that people are getting engaged and that a true governance renaissance can happen. I just hope we can do it in time before the forces of control shut down that possibility. So we got to get out there and work.
Absolutely. Well, we're getting to work here on some future podcasts for sure. So Jake, thanks again, man. Really do appreciate it. Really enjoy the conversation, and we're looking forward to be a part of the future of government conversation. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.